Today we're going to talk about Russia in the 1990s, part two. Those that did not watch the first installment, I want to make a short summary. This was about uh, the privatization campaign, the rise of Russian oligarchs, the shock therapy, the rise of prices, the hyperinflation, the rise of criminal gangs, the division of property, the seizure of property by criminal gangs and various oligarchs, and then the social problems that it generated, mass poverty, unemployment, and various other social issues described in the first part. So now we continue, and today we're going to talk more about the political aspects and then the social fallout, the situation on the ground, sort of the issues and problems that the Russian people encountered in the 1990s. The utmost purpose is to explain why I believe, as many others, that the 1990s was the worst period in modern Russian history. For some people, they would even be considered worse than under Stalin. And the reason for that is that under Stalin, if you were a Trotskyite, you were in trouble. If you were a party official connected to kulaks, you were in trouble. But if you were just a normal common citizen who went to work and then home and then stayed in his job and were not, involved in any critical thinking, you had no issues to worry about. And that was the majority of people. The problem with the 1990s, this pauperization, this wave of crime and unemployment affected everybody, absolutely everybody. And in that sense, it was a catastrophe uh, that had its political results. So, the first political result, of course, is the political instability that goes through 1992, the year of a shock therapy and privatization campaign. And as I said to you, the author of that was Gaidar. Yegor Gaidar, he's an economist, he's a prime minister, and the Duma would not confirm him as a prime minister. So already then, already in 1992, there's a rising resistance to these so-called reforms. And of course, one more time, these reforms are pretty much advised by Jeffrey Sachs and Aslund and many other Western and American advisors. They believe Russia has to have a rude awakening to the market and just swim, throw into the waters of rough tide and make it. The big crisis comes in 1993, and that is the shootout, sort of the crisis, the constitutional crisis that led to a bloody confrontation. So here are the facts, sort of the road to this escalation. Uh, as 1992 closed, there was definitely a great resistance and discontent all over Russia. And in that sense, Duma was a kind of a spokesman for the, um, uh, the discontent. Now, the Yeltsin people would later create this kind of a false myth that it was communist resistance, that it was the Communist Party that just kind of didn't want to face new economic reforms. This is totally wrong. The leaders of the Duma was Mr. Hasbulatov and a vice president. Now that office was abolished later on, Rudskoy. Now these two gentlemen, Hasbulatov and Rudskoy, were the ones who stood right next to Yeltsin in the tank in August 1991 when there was a putsch by the Communist Party officials and that Yeltsin projected himself as the leader of the democratic Russia. So these were not, communist hangovers from the old times. They were people who were right next to him on the tank that became a symbol of democratic Russia. So, but they actually, unlike Yeltsin, saw what was going on and could not just ignore it, and they decided to put a brake on this shock therapy and the privatization that went wild. Now, Yeltsin, of course, would not want to stop and wanted to continue, and essentially it was He didn't want a challenge of the Duma. In many ways, it's not a conflict over policy, it's a conflict over power. That is to say, the Duma, as the parliament, wants to put a brake on reforms, and they felt like they had all the right to do because, by American system, the Congress has the upper hand in terms of laws that have to be passed. The laws are not made by the president. The policy is, but not the laws. So the Duma puts the brake, and Yeltsin refuses. And then comes a confrontation, which is in September 1993, um, that essentially the Duma begins the impeachment proceedings, which is all pretty much legal. Everything else, everything they did was pretty much legal. The illegal things would be Yeltsin. And here I want to put a personal note. It so happened that in September 1993, I was still at Harvard, and then I was just about to leave for a year to Russia on my sabbatical as a professor. So I kind of saw both sides. In September, I was at Harvard, and there was a delegation from Russia of Yeltsin's supporters who came to Harvard and started trying to convince the public in America through these interviews and public fora that the communist conspiracies on underway to remove President Yeltsin. And that was the old hangers on of the Communist Party is trying to remove him from power. Now, just 2 weeks later, I flew to Moscow and started living there and doing my research in the archives. And the actual shooting at the Duma building, I was in Moscow. I actually saw it myself. I was just about 2 blocks away in Hotel Mir, and from the windows, I could actually see the Duma building being shelled. So basically, what happened was that when the Duma refused to disband and refused to abandon its challenge to Yeltsin, he decided to use force and presented it to the West as the communist conspiracy. This was the first time that there was violence in the streets since 1917. There were hundreds of people killed, there were tanks, there was artillery shelling of the Duma. It's called the White House in Russia because the building is white. And then there was this fire that dramatic pictures of whole floors of the Duma building burning. And finally, Hasbulatov and Rudskoy were arrested. They were not executed. They were just basically held for a while and then let go. But the political outcome of that was that Yeltsin pretty much destroyed the Duma, diminished its powers, a totally unilateral action that had no legal basis in the constitution. And he basically curtailed the powers of the Duma and ruled by decree for a while on his own. And then when the Duma was reconstituted, it had very, very limited powers that essentially made the president without any reach of parliamentary control. Of course, it removed the power of impeachment. Just in a sense, Putin inherited from Yeltsin a very, very strong presidency that cannot anymore be challenged. So after Yeltsin establishes himself as a kind of a dictator, he's going to the United States. The Clinton receives him, and there is all this nice talk of friendship and cooperation with the West. Of course, the West, totally ignored the bloodshed in Moscow and the destruction of the Duma, which is hypocrisy. Because if the West is so much in favor of democracy, then you cannot ignore the fact that in this democracy building you destroy the parliament and you bomb it and shell it and hundreds of people get killed. That's not something you just kind of walk over. But the Americans did because they received Yeltsin with open arms in 1994, and essentially as if he's been portrayed to the present time as the greatest democracy builder in Russia. Now the Germans pretty much shut up because for 1994 was scheduled the withdrawal of Russian troops from Germany. And again, they just couldn't believe that this, was happening. That Russia actually was going to fulfill its promise, and it was like Russia did, and they did withdraw the troops, and Germany was unified. But there was a promise made back to Gorbachev, which is not registered in any official records, that these territories will not be even part of Germany that was not supposed to be in the NATO troops in the unified Germany. And of course, it went for all the other territories that Russia withdrew its troops from, that they would not be incorporated at NATO. And 10 years later, of course, the West totally ignored it and started its peaceful expansion for the sake of democracy. So that's why the Russians perceived it as being duped once and twice and three times. First time is when they said there's democracy and then they destroy the parliament, and the second time when Russia withdraws its troops from Eastern Europe for the sake of cooperation and understanding in the new era of peace and cooperation. We're one now. We're all democracies, and then a few years later, the West moves in and installs its military personnel and expands NATO when Warsaw Pact is no more. Now, the foreign aspect is a separate story, but it is important in the evolution of public attitudes towards Yeltsin. The next point that comes tremendously important is also in this time in 94, 95 is the Yugoslav crisis and the Kosovo rebellion. And this is where, again, Russia is humiliated. Now, from the point of view of Russian generals and Russian political establishment that is kind of building up in its resistance to Yeltsin that would generate, a desire to get rid of him, which would be played out later on. Now, basically the crisis in Kosovo was that Kosovo separated itself from um, Serbia. Kosovo is Albanian. They're Muslim. They want self-determination. The West started to support them, and then the Serbians did not want to have them separated. They consider it a part of Serbia. Now, this is a very complicated issue, and most people had their sympathies to the Kosovars because they were, kind of oppressed Muslim minority. Now, what is not known, which is known now, is that the leaders of the Kosovar independence movement were human traffickers and gangsters and criminals, and they were not very nice people to support. But nevertheless, the West chose the side of the Kosovars and supported it. The problem was Russia, because Russia was kind of traditionally supporting Serbia. And in this crisis, I wrote a big article about it, so I'm just summarizing in a very short summary. Basically, the Western powers decided to get Russia a kind of a participation, some kind of role in the Kosovo crisis. And there was one particularly interesting episode when the Russian military came first to the Pristina airport and established control over it. And this was later on held against Yeltsin. Basically, the Russian military would tell them that they seized the airport first, and they could have shipped the Russian troops and presented the fait accompli to the Western powers, saying we are in control of Pristina, which is Kosovo's airport. And then it would have had a much better say in terms of the future of Kosovo and the negotiations about its status. And what happened is that Yeltsin kind of capitulated and ordered the Russian troops out of Kosovo airport, and the British took over. And there was one moment that almost went into shooting against each other, the British and the Russians, and basically Yeltsin capitulated. He just gave up all Russian assets and positions, and that is what was held against him, saying, you basically, Mr. Yeltsin, do always what the West tells you. You do not defend national interest of Russia, and that was something that was kind of building up. Another moment that really was a humiliation was a spectacular moment in 1994 when the Russian troops are leaving Germany and there's a band playing, and you could see on the video that is available that Yeltsin is drunk. He's drunk and he's kind of trying to conduct the orchestra, waving in his drunkenness. So in a sense, that was another humiliation, and there was just kind of a growing feeling among the ruling elites that this is a problem. I mean, this president has to go at some point. But finally, let me go back to the elections of 1996. In 1996, there were presidential elections in Russia. The first ones, really, you could say that they're the first ones because the previous ones were when Yeltsin was elected president. Russia was still a part of the Soviet Union. There was a Soviet president, Gorbachev, so they were not elections of a president of an independent country. It was elections of a president of a republic in the Soviet Union. So now you have the first real elections in an independent Russia, in a country that had its constitution, that had its disbanded parliament, that is still burnt out building, was still standing there. And again, I often went to Russia in those days, and I was there during the elections. So I have a complete story of my own observations. Moreover, I was a part of the team of observers from various countries who basically the observing was done by sitting in front of the TV and watching the reports as they were coming in. The Soviet, the Russian Federation is very, very big. So the elections begin in Vladivostok, and then there are 5 or 6, 8 time zones. So every hour you basically watch, how people had voted, and they're coming, with the estimates and with the opinion polls and that kind of stuff. So I remember very well, sitting all night long through the election night. My conviction was, and I publicly announced it to my colleagues in America, my conviction was that Yeltsin would lose. That there's no way that he could have won, given the mood in the country that was clearly observable. So here's what happened. We were sitting in the room watching the results, and the first results came from Vladivostok, and it was a smashing victory of Mr. Zyuganov, who was a Communist Party candidate, and essentially two candidates. There's one interesting story. There was a third candidate, Mr. Lebed, who was a general, but under suspicious circumstances, the helicopter that he was flying in crashed. And he kind of was no longer a candidate. And he was very charismatic and very popular, and he was a general, which means he had the army support. But all of a sudden, stuff happens, and his helicopter plunged down, and there's no more General Lebed. But Zyuganov was running. He's still, up until now, a major leader in the Communist Party of Russia. So Zyuganov was running, and the election results coming in one after another. First from Vladivostok, and then from Khabarovsk, and then from major Siberian cities. They're coming in through the night, and the news stopped coming in at 5 o'clock in the morning. And all the way up to that point, there were communist victories reported all through Siberia. So basically, and then all of a sudden at 5 in the morning, bang, blank out. There's no more coverage, there's no more news, nothing. It was just turned off. All communication and all connection was turned off. That you couldn't receive any, you couldn't, the telephone was cut off, there was no way to call anybody there was no TV contact, there was nothing. Essentially, it was just total blank out, as we were just kind of shrugging shoulders, looking around what's going on. Finally, at 8 in the morning, they announced Yeltsin's victory without any details. Now, I am convinced that Yeltsin lost. And now, if you look at the Russian scholarly literature on the subject, it's pretty much more or less admitted by most people that Zyuganov won and Yeltsin lost. Now, if that is the case, that probably the archives would have the story. That would mean that Yeltsin's regime is not only disbanded the Duma, but stole elections. The first elections in Russian Federation history were not free and fair, and they were covered up one more time by the West, that is complicit in supporting the criminal regime in power that had disbanded its own parliament and rigged elections in favor of Mr. Yeltsin.